Good evening, everybody. As part of my dark academia, thriller, horror, mystery, TBR thematic focus, I wanted to have an author spotlight on Stephen King for a tier ranking because I have read a lot of his books since the beginning of the year. And I wanted to wrap up my reading. Again, these tier list headers are from Gabby Reads, and they are Schitt's Creek quotes. The first tier is I love that journey is simply the best. The first book in this tier is 11/22/63. This is the time travel historical fiction that came out a couple of years ago that has a little bit of romance thrown in. It's set during the time of the JFK assassination, and I really love this book because I remember learning about this when I was in 8th grade in our 1960s unit, and I really loved being able to travel back to a time I learned about in history class and trying to unravel the mystery as things happened with this main character. The next book in this tier is Misery. Misery is the book that inspired the movie from the 1990s with Kathy Bates, and it's about this author who gets in a car accident and his obsessive fan takes him in to take care of him, and it's a thriller, which I really enjoyed. Like, this woman, Annie Wilkes, is really obsessed with this book series Misery, or the character's name is Misery, and she doesn't want the series to end, so she wants to help this author get out of his writer's block. And this had me on the edge of my seat the whole time. I really enjoyed it. And I really want to see the movie as well. And Katie Colson said in one of her videos that this book is a metaphor for Stephen King's alcoholism. And I can see how that could be possible, because maybe the main character in Misery was having a hallucination by thinking Annie Wilkes took her into his house and tried to nurse him back to health after his accident. The next book I wanted to talk about is Night Shift, which is a short story collection that I read at the beginning of November. And I really love short stories because they are ways to introduce yourself to Stephen King's writing if you're not too familiar with it. Of course, I started reading his books last January, but I loved his story collections because it really set me in the atmosphere of different characters. I just finished another short story collection of his that I don't know if I ranked yet. I didn't, but it would be ranked, and I love This Journey for Me, which is the next tier. And I really love his short stories, and I might revisit these short story collections, Night Shift and You Like It Darker, again, because maybe I might try to write my own horror short story, because I've never done that. The next book I read in this tier was On Writing. This is his memoir that came out a couple of years ago, and the first half of this book is the story of his life, and the second half of this book is tips that he gives writers. So it's a mixture of memoir and a book you can use for your own personal reference for writing tips, which I really enjoyed as a writer. The next book I wanted to talk about in the next tier, I Love This Journey for Me, was Billy Summers. Billy Summers is a crime thriller, which I really enjoyed reading. It kept me on the edge of my seat, much like The Outsider did. The Outsider is the last book in this tier, and the book that is in the middle, is Fairy Tail. And Fairy Tail is a fantasy book that focuses on a 17-year-old boy who is dealing with taking care of his elderly neighbor's dog and his father's alcoholism. So he uncovers a portal to a magical world, and I just really loved being sucked into the fantasy world he was being thrown into. I just loved picturing that in my head and what he was experiencing. The next section of this tier list is Kind Wishes, Warmest Regards, and the first book in this tier is Carrie. So there were too many religious overtones in this book because Carrie's mother is not only emotionally abusive, but she is really obsessive with like menstruation being evil and not being Catholic. So I really didn't like that, and I just didn't like the overall tone of this book because not only was Carrie bullied by her classmates, but she was also bullied by her mother. And so to me, this book seems like an adult version of Matilda, although there is no Miss Honey. And I guess that maybe if this was being compared to Matilda, then Carrie's mother could be considered Miss Trunchbull because of how it is discovered in the later part of Matilda, closer to the end, that Mrs. Trunchbull is the aunt of Miss Honey, and she was really abusive to her as when she was young. The next book I read in this tier is called The Body. This is a murder mystery book about a group of kids who try to solve a murder mystery in their town because they find a body washed up in a creek. And this is the book that inspired the 80s movie Stand By Me with River Phoenix and Kiefer Sutherland. And I really liked this movie. I mean, I liked the movie. The book is probably not one of my favorites by Stephen King, but I was familiar with the plot because it's the same plot as Stand By Me. So, the final book in this tier is The Shining, and Matt and I read this together in October, and we also watched the movie, and I just love the overall atmosphere of this book. As I have said in previous reviews, I really, really, really hate how he is so abusive to his son, and Shelley should have tried harder to take Danny away from him. The final listing in this tier is Oh David, and these are basically my DNFs. The first book in this tier, there are only 3 books in this tier. The first book is Holly. This is his most recent release from a couple of years ago, and you can tell he wrote it during COVID-19 because people are having meetings over Zoom and doing things virtually, and it's about this detective who's autistic who's trying to solve a murder. And it hit too close to home for me because of all the stuff related to the pandemic, so I had to DNF. I had a hard time focusing on the mystery plot because I was too zeroed in on the fact that this book was set during the pandemic. The next book I wanted to talk about is Pet Sematary. This is about a college professor who moves to a new town that his college is set in, and he witnesses one of his students getting hit by a car, and his new house has a cemetery where dead pets are in the backyard. I couldn't get into this book, so I DNF'd it at 140 pages. So I made it like halfway through or a quarter of the way, and I just couldn't get into it. The last book in this tier is The Institute and so this is another book that seems to be set like during pandemic isolation, and it's about kids who are sent to a special institute because they have supernatural powers. So I DNF this book because of the connection to COVID, and also political views being shoved in my throat, and also the characters in it seemed very similar to the characters on Stranger Things, and I have never seen that show, so if you like Stranger Things, then you will like The Institute by Stephen King, and I highly recommend it. Thank you for tuning in. Have a good night.